Welcome back to our short series of short videos on what C cubed is and what it does and how we can do something else that suits us better. I'd like to start looking at what C cubed actually does, not just what it is. And here's the first thing I'd like to look at is what it does to motivation and core human needs. So at the beginnings of C cubed and, before C cubed began, its roots, its foundations, its history, it was generally assumed that rewards and mostly punishments at that stage were going to motivate children to learn. So you might be, for example, beaten for not knowing your letters. And there's even, there was even a tradition of beating the letters into a child because we can get a trauma imprint, which of course is very, very different to real empowered learning. But, we haven't known everything for our whole history. But ancient writers habitually refer to teachers as tyrants and to schools as places of fear and pain. And that's a quote from an academic looking at the writings of Plutarch in ancient Greece. Now, Plutarch was one of the people who understood the difference between trauma imprints and real learning. And so he advocated for children to only be motivated through rewards. And through history, we've had this tension between those who think punishment's a good idea and those who say reward's a good idea. But generally, we've always believed that one way or the other, these things will work. Now, around the time my father was born, we started actually investigating this instead of just assuming it. And initially, it looked like it was holding up. You could reward animals to do things and they would do more of them. And so we integrated that into our school models, rewarding children for doing what we wanted them to do. However, there's always been people who suspected that this even wasn't a good idea, that it wasn't only about punishments, but rewards themselves don't necessarily work the way we think. Now, one of those people, when I was around the time I was born, one of those people decided to do an experiment to investigate this. So he got a room full of amazing puzzles that people could do, very interesting, lots of fun, solve these things. And he invited two groups to come and solve these puzzles, and they had a lovely time enjoying solving the puzzles. Then he invited them back, but this time, the one group, he just allowed them to solve the puzzles again. Here's another turn, feel free. And there's magazines in the corner if you get bored. And the other group, he said, I'm going to pay you for every one that you managed to solve. And they again engaged with the puzzle making. And one group was paid, and the other one just did it because they enjoyed doing it. And then he invited them back a third time and said, okay, here's another chance to play with my puzzles, but I don't have any money to pay you. It's all run out. And this was the first time that we saw people reading magazines in the corner. The people who were not being paid and had never been paid still engaged with the puzzles and enjoyed doing them, whereas those who had been paid stopped thinking the puzzles were fun. This was the beginning of self-determination theory, and that researcher was Edward Deci, later joined by Richard Ryan, and once the two of them got together, things expanded fast and far. So most people know their work these days just from this little tip of the iceberg: extrinsic motivation, which is rewards and punishments, and intrinsic motivation, which is doing something for its own sake. But they've expanded quite a lot further than that. And one of those expansions is looking at controlled motivation, which is trying to motivate other people, which is what we see in C cubed. And this has got quickly measurable results. You can threaten somebody or offer them something, and you can see whether they do it or not. But as Edward Deci showed in his early experiments, there's a danger of extinction of motivation when you shift to controlled motivation. Now, obviously, controlled motivation can only use extrinsic rewards and punishments, extrinsic motivation, because you are trying to control somebody else. We can't control somebody's internal state. So the form of motivation that goes along with intrinsic motivation, they're called autonomous motivation, autonomy. So this is motivating ourselves. It's where natural learning sits in contrast to C cubed. When we take up a hobby, we're not doing it in order to get a reward or a punishment. We're doing it because we love it. We enjoy it. It feels good to us. Now, this kind of autonomous motivation is less measurable when we look at what's going on, because there's a whole internal process that we can't necessarily track. But it's much more sustainable, as we saw with this example of the group that still continue to do the puzzles because they were interesting. Now, autonomous motivation obviously works with intrinsic motivation, but it can also work together with extrinsic motivation. I can dance because I love dancing, or I can decide to get my next level dancing certificate. I can even enter dance contests. I can even decide to be a professional and get paid for my dancing. What matters is, do I feel like somebody is threatening me or bribing me to do something? Because if I feel that way, it's not going to be fun anymore, and I'm likely to lose my motivation. Whereas if I feel like it's my idea, I'm going for this, these are my goals, extrinsic motivation doesn't necessarily lead to a loss of motivation. It can still be very sustainable. Why is this? Well, one explanation is that because autonomous motivation fulfills core human needs, whereas controlled motivation undermines the fulfillment of core human needs. What are those? This is another part of self-determination theory. And self-determination theorists, hundreds of psychologists around the world in many, many different cross-cultural contexts, have researched and concluded that all humans possess three universal, innate psychological needs that we are born with and that we will be driven by for the rest of our lives. These are like psychological nutrients. They drive our motivation, and seeking fulfillment of these needs is what moves us to act, to learn, and to grow. And our wellness and thriving is driven by whether or how well they're met. Our suffering is driven by how badly they're neglected or thwarted. Thwarting is when we actually get the opposite of what we need. Neglect of the fulfillment of these needs leads to a lack of motivation and stagnation of growth, while thwarting can lead us to psychological distress, suffering, and it can even result in trauma. What are these needs? The first is competence. I need to feel like I'm capable. I can manage what I need, and I need to experience a sense of mastery. Autonomy. I need to feel like I'm in charge of my own choices, own my own life, and doing things in a way that's meaningful and suited to my uniqueness. I need to feel related. I need to feel like I belong, like I'm valued, like I'm connected, and that I can care and be cared for. Now, dignity and safety aren't listed as official core needs in SDT because they play a different kind of role in motivation. But we can all agree that they are also universal human needs essential for well-being. It's just a no-brainer. Dignity, feeling like I'm good enough in myself as a person, not shameful. I'm a human, not an object. I'm seen, I'm respected, I'm treated fairly, and I have the privacy that I need. Safety. I'm physically safe. I'm not in danger. I'm not sick or in pain. I feel sufficiently comfortable. My senses are not overwhelmed, and my needs are sufficiently met, and I trust that they will continue to be. They're not being threatened. So now, what happens in C cubed schooling to these core needs? Well, C cubed systematically undermines all five of these core needs. It's a coordinated attack on well-being and thriving. That's a very strong statement to make. So let's have a look at that in more detail. What exactly does C cubed do to competence, autonomy, relatedness, dignity, and safety? Remembering that these are subjective things that we feel. So not does C cubed increase our competence in an objective sense. What does C cubed do to our feeling around being competent and good enough and autonomous and connected to the people around us and dignified and safe. Well, autonomy and dignity are thwarted by being compelled, microcontrolled, and forced into a standardized system regardless of our diversity and individuality. Competence and dignity are thwarted by being forced to tackle learning to which we are not personally suited or not ready, making us feel stupid, and by compelled assessments supported by cohorting. We have to compete against our peers, which is very distressing, especially when the focus is on our weaknesses and not our strengths. The vast majority of students don't win or rank high at the end of the school game, and that is by C-cubed design. Relatedness thrives in collaboration, but it's automatically at risk in any context of competition. Think about it. The moment that we're competing with somebody, we tend to see them as our opponent rather than as our companion. In compelled competition where we're being forced to compete, it becomes extremely difficult to meet the need for relatedness. Safety? Well, any space where other cards are impacted will impact safety. Hurting people hurt people, which means that low cards generally are going to feed bullying. Any space where obedience is ensured leaves children open to abuse because they can't learn to say no if they're not allowed to say no. They can't walk away when they're forced to be there. They can't protest without consequences, and they can therefore be afraid to speak up. So places and systems that don't meet core needs, and worse, actually thwart them, don't support thriving and well-being for anyone. Again, this is obvious when we think about it. But they also don't support optimal learning. Most kids who hate school love learning. It's just very hard to thrive when our core needs are not met. Being anxious or bored in school, struggling, failing, dropping out, many mental health issues, and much bullying, and even much teacher burnout are all a direct result of the C-cubed structure. A structure that school doesn't even actually need. We didn't know any of that back then. But we do know it now. And now that we know better, it's time to do better. Because the problem isn't school. The problem is squashing schools into the C-cubed model. It's absolutely possible for schools and home ed parents to meet all core needs instead of neglecting and thwarting them. We just need to get out of the C-cubed box. We need to get away from this cohorted, compelled competition. It doesn't support education and it doesn't support thriving. But getting out of that box is easier said than done, depending on our circumstances. Some of us might manage it. We could just offer our child a democratic school or found one. But yeah, school systems are big and unwieldy, and there's a lot holding them in place. So there are some simple first steps that can make a real difference, because meeting core needs will help anywhere and everywhere, in any age, any setting. Meeting core needs will help. But how do we go about meeting core needs? When we've been educated, pretty much all of us have been educated in C-cubed settings. And those settings do not teach you how to meet your core needs or anybody else's core needs. In fact, they teach us to compete against other people and pull their needs apart to try and get our own met. We've got no idea how to do win-win meetings of needs. Heck, C-cubed settings don't even help us learn what core needs are. So here is one simple way to start figuring out how to meet motivational core needs in any setting. I call it the cards game. So the cards game offers us an easy way to understand ourselves and each other and make useful decisions. It can help us figure out why we feel the way we do, why other people act as they do, and even how to stop being manipulated by advertising and fake news and other people trying to use controlled motivation on us. We absolutely can use the cards game just to support our own well-being and thriving. However, it was first designed to help replace C cubed, to help adults, parents, educators, and facilitators support young people in learning, coping, behaving, and thriving. Because what we may think of as naughty, obstinate, being difficult, confusing, worrisome, or just plain WTF is often just about having too many of their cards in red. When we find ways to bring their cards up into green, everything gets easier and more fun for everyone. But how do you spot red cards? How do you bring them up into green? Well, that's why it's a game, because that's the easiest way to learn. So if you like, you can play it here online for free. And if you like it, please let me know what you think on the feedback page. And if you don't like it, you can also let me know what you think on the feedback page. And if you have any suggestions or requests for it. And that's the address. And if you go there, you can go play the cards game for free. And it is really free, really, truly free. It's real free, not bait and switch, not in exchange for your data, just for free because freedom, because true gifting, because win, win, win. Because those are three things: freedom, gifting, win, win, win. That C cubed has actually shut down, and we can now start to reclaim now that we know better. Speaking of beautiful and true and C cubed, when being good and right or correct are thoroughly colonized by controlled motivation, as happens in C cubed, to the point that there's hardly any space to be autonomously motivated to be good or right, then what happens? I'll see you over at the next video that I'm going to be making in this series, what C cubed does to truth and goodness. But until then, boom, 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 boom. I hope that you will enjoy playing the cards game. Bosom. Because play is what it's all about.